This video is about care ethics, a more contemporary ethical theory. In some ways, care ethics is seen as a kind of reintroduction of character-based focus on ethics, similar to Aristotle, but it's not the same as virtue theory. It is its own distinct theory, drawn largely out of the feminist movement, but meant to apply to all people. For our investigation of care ethics, we're going to first look at an article by Virginia Held, where she talks about some of the problems present in traditional ethics and offer some solutions. And then we'll look at an article by Joan Tronto called An Ethic of Care, where she presents her version of care ethics. So Held's article, Feminist Transformations of Moral Theory. The goal that Held sets out to accomplish in her paper is to explain how ethics has developed throughout history, in particular with regards to three main areas of concern, and to discuss how feminists have tried to change the conversation in these areas. So for each of these theories, we'll see the traditional approach as Held explains it, and why that approach is problematic. And then we'll see the broad solutions that Held offers, a way to do moral philosophy without encountering these problems. So the first problem she sees in traditional philosophy is what she calls the reason-emotion distinction. Traditionally, from ancient Greek philosophy onward, the ideal person has been what is often called the man of reason. This is particularly true in ethics, but also in all philosophy. So the idea here is that the ideal person, the ideal way to deal with ethics is going to be through pure reason. Kant is a good example of this approach. Held points out that this rational ideal has often been connected with masculinity, whereas a focus on emotion and irrationality has been connected to femininity. Of course, she doesn't think that this is an appropriate distinction, but she thinks this is the distinction that has been made historically. And so she points out that the problem here is twofold. One, that it might be the case that emotion and passion and sympathy and those sorts of things are of use to us in our moral investigations, and two, that this commonly the common gendered element here is problematic. That as she says in this quote here from page 325, women have been seen as emotional rather than rational beings, and thus as incapable of full moral personhood. So of course she thinks that this is an issue. She thinks that both men and women are capable of making moral decisions, of acting rationally and emotionally. And so she wants to have us develop a theory which takes both of these elements of human experience, reason and emotion, into account, and which offers a more balanced view in terms of gender. She also points out that Kant's deontology and Mill's utilitarianism are good examples of theories which focus on reason. They both emphasize rationality and abstract thinking. They both have universal principles which we should be able to apply in all moral situations, right? The categorical imperative for deontology and the greatest happiness principle for utilitarianism. And so she's just pointing to common modern moral theories which have this issue, in addition to noting that ancient Greek theories, for example, Aristotle's virtue theory, focus on reason to the exclusion of emotion as well. So the solution that Held offers is to say, explore, as she says, explore the importance of cultivating what she calls moral emotions. Rather than trying to rid ourselves of these emotions, we ought to be practicing them in a measured and correct way. So, for example, cultivating emotions like empathy or sympathy or caring for other people might be important, and she thinks are important, to our ability to reason about morality. So instead of she's not advocating that we abandon reason in favor of emotion exclusively, but that we bring emotion sort of to the table and use both. Right. She wants to respect the role that emotion plays in the moral process, and she wants to develop a theory which accepts that it's okay to theorize about morality, starting with what she calls fully embedded moral subjects. To recognize, and this will make more sense when we talk about some of the other issues she points out, but to recognize that human beings are embedded in a particular context, with a particular family circumstance, and with a particular emotional as well as rational outlook. So again, the idea is not to prioritize emotion over reason, but to stop prioritizing reason over emotion. So she wants to use both reason and emotion in our moral decision-making processes in a way that traditional theories have failed to do, she says. The next problem that she points out is what she calls the public-private distinction. So again, traditionally, starting from the ancient Greeks and moving on up to more contemporary philosophy, society has been largely divided into two realms, the public realm and the private realm. Historically, the public realm has been seen as the place of morality, as she says, where man transcends his animal nature, while the private realm has been seen as the place where our natural and biological needs are met, where reproduction occurs, for example, where sort of caring for family occurs. And so that is not a place, traditionally, where morality has had a foothold. The kind of gendered element that she points out to here, fairly obvious, that for large portions of human history, men have had exclusive rights to the public realm, whereas women were relegated to the private realm. For example, in Aristotle's time, right, men were the ones who were engaged in politics and trade and work outside the home, and women's jobs included home care and child raising, and in ancient Greece, managing the household in general, managing any help that they had and all that kind of thing. Right. So the idea here, again, you have kind of two components. The gendered component, that this has historically priced women out of the moral landscape, but also, and perhaps more importantly for us, the more broad component, that this has left out of the moral picture huge elements of human life, right? For example, often in the past, people have allowed things to happen in the home that would not be permissible in public. And the excuse has been, well, you know, that's private. So, for example, it has been, right, illegal for ages to hit someone, I don't know, a business partner or something, or a person at a bar, right? But for a large part of human history, it was perfectly acceptable to hit your spouse in your home. Jack, away. Sorry. And the idea was, well, that's private, that's not a place where morality works or functions. Right? That morality is about what we do outside, and our private lives are something else. Additionally, she says, Held says, there hasn't been a lot said in the moral literature about the moral importance of things like mothering or parenting, we might say today, care work, how relationships ought to be structured, that kind of thing, has all generally been seen as part of the private realm and thus not something that moral theory would comment on. And so Held's solution here is to essentially bring morality into that private realm. Right. As with the reason emotion distinction, we have already made quite a bit of headway in terms of the feminist aspect of this idea, right? That right, women are active in the public realm in our time. But she thinks the larger picture is still problematic. That there's still not enough done in terms of our understanding of morality with respect to traditionally private affairs. And so her solution here is to recognize that the private realm is deeply affected by public issues of culture and politics and things like that, and that the private realm in turn impacts the public realm. What happens at home, how someone is raised, that sort of thing, impacts how they live in the public sphere. And so again, to provide a more integrated understanding of human life and the place of morality in that life. In addition, she says that we should acknowledge the moral importance of traditionally private activities like, as I said, parenting, relationship issues, that sort of thing. So the idea is, again, to kind of disintegrate this distinction a little bit, to value what morality can teach us about both the public and private realm and our interactions therein. And the third issue that Held discusses is what she calls the concept of self. Traditionally, the self in philosophy has been seen as what she refers to as the atomistic individual. There is an atomistic view of the self where we are supposed to view human beings as entirely devoid of context. When we're making rational decisions, you can see this in particular with someone like Kant, we are supposed to, as much as we can, and ideally completely, right, divorce ourselves from our context, from our particular situations, from our cultures, from our particular family life, all of that stuff, and we're supposed to figure out what is moral for all people at all times, using, right, to use Kant's language, pure reason. So the idea is that instead of viewing the human being as necessarily existing in relation to other people, in relation to their culture, in relation to their beliefs and ideals, traditional moral philosophy has viewed the individual as entirely independent of all of those things. And again, the kind of gendered element here has been that traditionally women were seen as incapable of having that kind of independent, atomistic existence, because women were often viewed as entirely connected to their family. So a good example of this is that in many cultures, even today, when a woman... when a woman has a child, she is no longer referred to by her own name. Instead, she's referred to as mother of so-and-so. And so that's just kind of a cultural example where you can see what Held is talking about, the idea that women have historically not been seen as capable of this kind of individual existence, while this kind of atomistic individual existence has been the ideal understanding of the human being. And so Held's solution here is to essentially recognize that no one is actually totally independent, totally free from context, totally individual and atomistic, as they say. Right? So we have to recognize, she says, that every person is what she calls a particular other. That each individual is an individual. that we all have our own thoughts and ideas and ambitions and cultural connections and family connections and relationships and all of those things. And that all of that information is morally relevant. So instead of trying to push that aside, as traditional philosophers have done, Held argues that we should accept all of that information as morally relevant. So she's not advocating for relativism, but instead what she's doing is saying we need to accept the fact of human life that we are not actually totally independent, that we cannot escape, try as we might, some of these factors of human life that are built upon our relationships with one another, with our culture, with our country, all of that stuff. So instead of trying to push that stuff aside, she says we need to embrace it and view the self as intersubjective, as necessarily relational, rather than autonomous and individual. So, she says that we ought to value and maintain what she calls the larger relational unit, and build a moral theory which takes that into account. So that's Held's account of some particular issues she sees with how traditional moral philosophy has been done, and some ways in which we can develop a moral theory that solves some of those problems. And so now what we have is a kind of example of a theory which tries to do that, and this is called the Ethics of Care. And so we have Tronto's article here, which gives us a particular instantiation of the ethics of care. So in Tronto's particular version here, she points out that all human beings are morally required to care for others. That care is an essential part of moral action. And you cannot be a fully moral person if you do not care for others in a literal sense. So she says here, this quote from page 251, to be a morally good person requires, among other things, that a person strives to meet the demands of caring that present themselves in his or her life. And then she goes on to say, or actually, so we'll stop there for a sec. So essentially what she's saying is, it's not only about caring. That's not the only morally relevant action that we can do. But it is an essential characteristic of the fully moral person, that they maintain these caring relationships. And it's not enough, she says, to kind of pay someone to do that work for us. We have to occasionally, not every second of the day, right, literally take care of other people, of our family, of our friends, of people in need, etc. Unlike some care ethicists, Tronto does not think that care ethics is a fully developed standalone theory. Instead, she says, as we see here from this quote from page 252, it's not meant to serve as a total account of morality, but it's supposed to be a kind of add-on to some other moral theory. A variety of moral theories could work. What she's more concerned about is making sure that these elements of human life, our relationships, our embedded nature, our emotional lives, are taken into account and seen as morally valuable. Right. The other important element to note here with care ethics is that it is an ethic that is focused on practice rather than principles. So we're not going to find here a single principle of morality like we had with the categorical imperative or the greatest happiness principle, or even the kind of principle of virtue as a mean from Aristotle. Right? Instead, what we find here is a discussion of how we can go about the practice of caring for others. And the way that she develops this is to talk about what she calls the 4 ethical elements of care. The first of these elements is attentiveness. The idea here is that, of course, we cannot care for other people unless we notice that they need care, and the way that we notice that is through being attentive. So we have to open ourselves up to receive the information from outside that someone needs our help and our care. She says that this requires us to be passive in some sense, in the sense of being open to notice that people need our help. Sometimes caring for others requires us to suspend our own goals and ambitions, our own plans, in order to take the steps to care for that other person once we've noticed that they need care. An essential element here to attentiveness is she says that ignorance of the needs of other people is a moral evil. Right. This is especially true for what's called willful ignorance, but also habitual ignorance is a problem in morality. Right. It is not an excuse, she says, to say, oh, I didn't know that people needed help. As a human being who is capable of opening yourself up in this way, you are morally required to be attentive. Just like with deontology, right, you're morally required to refrain from lying. Just like in utilitarianism, you're morally required to maximize happiness. In care ethics, as Tronto explains it, you are morally required to be attentive to the needs of others and sometimes to meet those needs. She does point out, however, that we cannot allow our attentiveness to be too open, too broad. We have to also be attentive to our own needs. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Being attentive to ourselves while also being attentive to others. Sometimes suspending our own goals, but not all the time, because then we will put ourselves in a position where we're not meeting those goals at all, and where we're perhaps in need of care as well. So the next step after we have, through our attentiveness, noticed that someone needs care, is to take responsibility to care for them. She points out here that this is different from obligation. It's not that we are obligated to care. It's that we are making the choice to take responsibility. She thinks that obligation is a little bit too... excuse me. She thinks that obligation is a little bit too maybe legalistic, right? That it doesn't emphasize choice as much as she wants it to. So the idea here is that we choose to take responsibility when we see that there's a need for care that we can meet. Now, sometimes we take responsibility for needs that we caused. For example, the parent taking responsibility for a child that they created. But also, we're obligated to assume responsibility or take responsibility for needs that we had no part in causing, if we know that there's no other way that those needs will be met. So her example here is the German people who helped Jews in World War II. Right? She says they saw the need for care. They saw that their Jewish neighbors needed help. They didn't cause this need for help. Perhaps they, didn't vote for Hitler or whatever. But they see that there's a need that's met. They know that no one else is going to meet it, so they take responsibility to meet that need, right? And so both types of taking responsibility are important. To take responsibility when we've contributed to the need, and to take responsibility when we know that we're the only one who will or can. However, she says, we have to be careful when we choose to take responsibility for someone's needs that we're actually competent to meet those needs. So she says we should only take responsibility when we know that we are capable of meeting the needs of the person that we are trying to help. Right. And that's what this idea of competence is. We have to be competent. If we aren't, then we should not take responsibility to meet that person's needs. This might seem a little bit counterintuitive because we often say things like, well, we should try our best, right? We should do what we can. But Toronto says the problem with that is that if we take responsibility for something that we're not competent to do, then we're actually doing the person who is in need a disservice because we've said we'll take care of it. Now, no one else is going to come and help that person because we've said we'll do it. But if we can't do it properly, then that person's needs aren't actually going to be met. Right? So the example that Toronto uses here is the math teacher example. So she says, imagine there's a school where their math teacher has suddenly quit and they need someone to teach math. They don't have any other math teachers, so they go to another teacher, say the English teacher, and say, hey, look, I know you don't know anything about math, but, we need a math teacher, so come and teach these students calculus. Right. The English teacher should refuse, according to Toronto. They should say, look, I'm not competent to meet this need. I don't know enough calculus to be able to teach these students. If I attempt it, then they're not going to learn what they need to learn. Right? So it's better for that teacher to refuse and to kind of push the school into hiring another math teacher. That's the idea. If we take another kind of common example, it would be something like if you have a parent who is sick and needs round-the-clock nursing care, but you don't know how to do that, right? You don't know everything that you need to know to be an effective nurse for them. Toronto says you shouldn't take responsibility to meet their needs. You should hire a nurse, find another family member who is capable of doing that, something like that. Because if you attempt it but you're unsuccessful, then your family member isn't going to get the care that they need. Right? Maybe they're not going to be moved frequently enough and then they'll get bed sores. Maybe their medication isn't going to be handled properly and then they'll have side effects, something like that. Right? So we must be competent to meet the needs that we take responsibility to meet. And finally, she talks about responsiveness. This is a key element of care ethics because this is where a lot of the potential issues with care are going to be sort of head off at the pass. So the idea of responsiveness is that this is the need to maintain a continual dialogue between the person who's giving the care and the person who's receiving the care. It's about having effective communications on both sides. Right. One of the problems with care, and we'll talk more about this in a second, is that caring relationships are necessarily inherently unequal. Right? You have a person who is in need and you have a person meeting those needs, and there's an inequality there. And if we're not careful, that inequality can kind of turn sour and result in anger or rage or kind of petty disagreements and all kinds of things. And the way to stop that from happening, according to Toronto, is to have this element of responsiveness. The caregiver is supposed to talk to the person who is in need about what they think their needs are, what they would like the carer to do. And they are supposed to do that. They're not supposed to kind of take over. Right? And on the same token, the care receiver is supposed to talk to the caregiver and let them know when they're unhappy with the care they're receiving. Let them know if they think the caregiver is doing too much and maybe neglecting themselves. That kind of thing. So it's a kind of back and forth communication. A good example of this, or I should say, the reason this is necessary is because if we're not responsive, we might end up not meeting people's needs, actual needs. We might end up having issues of anger, as I said before. Several things can go wrong. So one example that I heard from a friend was that they went on a kind of mission trip to another country, and what they did when they were there was they built a well for a village. And they were really excited to build this well because without the well, the women in the village had to walk really far to go and get water every day, right? So they built the well and they're really excited about it. And then they discovered that no one was using it. Right? And they asked, why aren't you using this well? We made a lot of effort to build this for you, to meet this need that you had for accessible water. And the people in the village said, yeah, but we didn't want that. We didn't have that need. Right? We enjoy going to get the water. That's the only time that the women had to kind of chit-chat and have their own time before they had to go back to their families and take care of everything that had to do with their family life. And so, because they weren't responsive, because they didn't have an open dialogue, the needs of the village were not actually met. Right? They kind of met a need that they thought was there, but they were wrong because they didn't ask. Right? And that can go both ways, but that's just kind of one example. So that's how care ethics is supposed to work. We're supposed to kind of balance our needs, our own needs, with needs that we see in our families, in our communities. We're supposed to, at least sometimes when we're competent, take responsibility and meet the needs of other people. And when people see that we are in need, and they're competent, they're supposed to help us. But Toronto says, look, this isn't a problem-free philosophy. There are some potential issues that people bring up, some of which she thinks she can effectively deal with, and some of which she just accepts. And we've already talked about some of these, especially the idea that there can be anger. But there are more than that. So, for example, she says, if we are too attentive, if we take on too much, we can end up being too self-sacrificing. We have to kind of have a balancing act between caring for ourselves and caring for others. And that's how we're supposed to avoid this issue of self-sacrifice, over-sacrifice. In addition, she says there is, often people say, an issue of neediness. That the people who receive care also need to recognize that there are structural difficulties in this situation. She says in societies like ours, where needing help is viewed negatively, it's easy for the needy person to kind of feel resentment that they are in need of help. And so maybe to not be as open as they should be. And so the solution here is to recognize that care is an important moral element, to recognize that it's not a problem or an embarrassment to need help, that everyone needs help at some stage in their life, and to open up this realm of caring as a morally important pursuit. Another common problem that people have with care is that it is too parochial. And that's to say that it is too limited in its scope because, as she says, it involves engagement with the concrete, the local, the particular. Right? It's about caring for individual people on a one-on-one basis. And this is a problem, according to many people, because this means that care has very little to say about what we should do, for example, for people that we don't meet. Right? What is our moral obligation to the starving child in another country? What is our moral obligation to people in a war-torn area? That sort of thing that we're never going to encounter. So there are two ways in which care ethicists deal with this. Some care ethicists say, yeah, that's just how morality works in care ethics. We aren't morally responsible for meeting those needs because they're not direct needs that we are engaged with. Other people in those communities are responsible for meeting those needs. And the idea would be that if everyone is meeting needs in their communities, then everyone's needs will be met. Toronto takes a different approach, and she says, if we remember from the introduction, care ethics is not necessarily a standalone theory, and so there might be other theories that we can use to help us understand what we should do morally in those situations. So it's just beyond the scope of care. So we talked about the issue of anger, And the other problem that sometimes people see is what she calls detached care and otherness. This is a problem that comes when we try to meet the needs of our community not on a one-on-one basis, but through things like taxation or the creation of welfare programs or things like that. When care becomes disconnected in that way and it's no longer personal, she says, people can, who are on the giving end of those schemes, paying their taxes, that sort of thing, can start to feel anger at the people who need those services. They can start to feel that some people are undeserving, that kind of thing. And they start to view those people as other than themselves instead of having a relationship. And she says the way to avoid this is to remember that care is personal, right? That it's not done best in terms of taxes or welfare systems or things like that. Those might be important, but those aren't how we should focus our caring efforts. Instead, we should focus our caring efforts on one-on-one relationships of care. And that can keep us from othering people, keep us from seeing those in need of care as other than ourselves and as somehow inferior to us. So those are the basic outline of care ethics as Tronto envisions it, with our 4 ethical elements as, rather than a principle, a kind of structure for how we should go about the practice of caring for others.